history of the 1920s. We have been talking so far in this course about, well, some good aspects of history, some bad aspects of history. The decade, including the First World War, was overall a pretty gloomy decade, and we're going to start there with some of the problems resulting from the war and accompanying the end of the war. But the 20s were overall, at least in the United States, an extremely good time. Our epithet for this decade, the Roaring 20s, is something that indicates that. We'll see later that it wasn't so great in all places in Europe. But in the United States, the 20s were a decade of optimism. So let's start with actually the aftermath of the war. November 11th, 1918 was the date of the signing of the armistice that ended the fighting, or at least mostly ended the fighting of the Great War. However, it took a while for things to settle into anything like normalcy. And in fact, the last part of that earlier decade, 1918, 1919, 1920, were actually extremely disturbing years. There were serious social and economic disruptions. What kind of thing do I have in mind? Well, epidemics. The Spanish flu, as we'll see, was a serious problem that killed many more people than World War I had killed. There were problems with hundreds of thousands of people starved to death in Germany as a result of the Allied blockade, which was not removed for months, even after the armistice was signed. There was continued fighting. A war for Polish independence, for example, contested by people within Germany and within Russia. We had a serious recession in the United States and most of the other countries affected by the war. There were labor disputes, strikes, violence often accompanied those. There were race riots in a number of American cities, and finally a series of anarchist bombings. And so things in 1919, 1920 really seemed to be spinning out of control. That image from Yeats, that the falcon cannot, hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, very much felt to be the situation, even at the end of the First World War. First of all, the Spanish flu epidemic. It was unbelievably widespread. It lasted not just for one flu season, but for 3 entire years, as it swept around the globe from the very beginning of 1918 to the end of 1920. Its spread was facilitated by the fact that lots of people were leaving the war zone, where the flu began to be a very serious problem, and spread to all of their home countries as they went back home. But it's relatively rare that a virus turns out to be both extremely virulent and also very easily contagious. And this flu was like that. It was extremely bad to get this version of the flu, and it spread very quickly. An estimated 20 to 50 million people around the world died. Keep in mind that war deaths from the First World War, if we include just military deaths, were under 10 million. If we include civilian deaths, under 17 million. So even by the most conservative count, the Spanish flu killed more people than the war did. As much as 3% of the world's population. Now, 1919 saw all sorts of other turmoil in the United States, and things were generally worse in other countries. We were relatively unaffected by the war, and so things were actually better here than elsewhere. But still, they were, well, really divisive in various ways. Prohibition passed. It was long on the agenda of the progressives, and finally it was enacted. So, as of January 1919, it was illegal to sell or consume alcohol in the United States. Anarchist mail bombings began as a targeted assassination attempt, but then more generally, there were bombings on Wall Street and a variety of other places. In what was known as the Red Summer, there were race riots in 38 U.S. cities. The Red Scare occurred in 1919. 14,000 left-wing agitators were held without charge, and some were deported. There were strikes in Seattle, in Boston, in Pittsburgh, and a variety of other places. And President Wilson himself had a stroke in October. After that, it's thought that his wife was largely running the country. He was incapacitated and really not able to perform the duties of the office for the rest of his term. Now, Prohibition, here you see people pouring barrels of beer down into the sewers. Oh, I know, heartbreaking. Here, bombings In this case, in the middle of the city in New York, the Wall Street explosion. There you see it from a different angle. There were a number of people injured and killed in that. Here you see on Wall Street today the marks left on the sides of buildings from that explosion in 1919. Actually, it wasn't just New York City. There were 9 bomb explosions in 8 eastern cities. Not only New York, but Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. One of them exploded at Mitchell Palmer's home. It was an attempt to assassinate him, an attempt to assassinate a judge. Eventually, people traced this back to an anarchist group and figured out who was doing this. 19 were arrested in the terrorist bomb plot. It is worth remembering that the Red Scare here was something that began with something real. There really was a justification for that fear. There was an anarchist/communist group that was planting these bombs, and it caused significant destruction and really did terrorize eastern cities. On the other hand, most of the people arrested, those 14,000, had nothing to do with the bombing. They were people who subscribed to certain left-wing periodicals, or in other ways were socialists. Eugene Debs was among them, but most of these people had no connection to violence or no link to any of this. In any case, we've talked a little bit about the rash of lynchings that occurred in 1918, 1919, 1920. This was a serious problem. 62, as you see here, during 1918. This was, can I call it the height, the depth of that sort of racial problem in the United States. There were correspondingly race riots in 38 cities, including in Chicago, where there were 26 killed. Here you see a church being burned. Strikes in Seattle and Boston. And then finally, insult to injury, the 1919 World Series ended up being fixed. It was a scandal, the Black Sox scandal. It was the Cincinnati Reds facing off against the Chicago White Sox. This was the nation's national pastime. There was no NFL. There was no NBA. Sports in the United States at that time essentially meant baseball. And the World Series was the highlight of that. Everyone expected the Chicago White Sox to win. In fact, they lost, and lost embarrassingly. It emerged very quickly that there was a gambling scandal and that a number of the White Sox players were being paid to throw the games. And so it shook people's faith in what they thought of as an innocent part of, well, American cultural life. In any case, the result of all of this disruption, all of those social and economic problems, there was, incidentally, at the end of the war, a severe recession as well. All of these problems led to an overwhelming victory by the Republican candidate, Warren G. Harding, over the Democratic candidate, Cox. In fact, here you see that the electoral L that I had been describing really just became a north-south split. What should have been the Mountain States part of that L just disappeared. People were desperate for things to get back to normal. And indeed, Harding's platform was a return to normalcy. Getting things back to normal, stopping the disruption, stopping the turmoil. He was elected in 1920 with over 60% of the popular vote, so it was an overwhelming victory. It was also the first election in which women had the vote. Women's suffrage had passed during the last part of the Wilson administration. And here was Harding's campaign theme. America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Not surgery, but security. And so Harding was going on a campaign essentially to bring things back to normal, to end the turmoil, to cure the recession, to stop the social and economic disruptions that were tearing the country apart. Here you see his inauguration. And there he is with his wife. Harding was a very serious man. He was somebody who was himself morally upright, and yet his administration ended up being plagued by scandal, as we'll see. Here he is shaking hands with Babe Ruth to throw the first baseball out for the season. As you can see, Harding is much more excited than Ruth about this meeting. In any case, well, it is a terrible handshake. And poor Ruth looks like he's about to cry. Anyway, yes, there he is. There's the person painting his official portrait. Well, he did inherit a severe recession. The country was in turmoil for a lot of reasons. Harding was a believer in laissez-faire economics. That is to say, he believed that the government should not be involved in the economy, and practiced a policy of non-interference. His reaction to the severe recession in 1920 and 1921 was simply to do nothing at all. And, well, to do nothing, that's not quite fair, because actually what he did is cut government spending. Government spending had ballooned because of the First World War. He pared back spending sharply by 40%. That's a radical budget cut by anybody's standards. And so that, you might have thought, would really cause further economic pain. But it didn't, actually. The economy boomed. And what resulted from his cuts in spending, his tax cuts, were actually this burst of prosperity that gave us the Roaring '20s. He also freed all of those political prisoners who had been jailed under the Wilson administration, the 14,000 leftists, the people like E.E. Cummings, who had been arrested for saying he didn't hate Germans. All of those people were freed right at the beginning of Harding's term. Now, nevertheless, 2 years into his term, there was a scandal known as the Teapot Dome scandal. His Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fell, had been taking bribes for releases on federal property. $400,000, which at the time was a lot of money. And, I mean, it's still a lot of money, but it was a lot more money than multiple millions. There, Albert Fell is. And that shattered Harding. A lot of that went back to Harding, but Harding knew nothing about this scandal. In fact, he was furious with Fell. When he found out about it in the papers, he called Fell into his office, grabbed him by the lapels, and shook him, saying, "Man, what have you done to me?" Well, after that, he felt devastated. He felt as if he had lost that popular mandate. And so here is a photograph of him from later in his term where he is standing in the woods looking lost and alone. It did lose him a huge amount of popular support, even though he was not personally involved. Well, not too long after that, he died of a stroke. And Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, became president. Coolidge is best known for saying that the chief business of the American people is business. Economy is idealism in its most practical form. Coolidge was an unusual president. For one thing, he didn't run for the presidency. He became president when Harding died. But he was also an unusual character. He was not a typical politician. Here he was, pictured on his Vermont farm, in a kitten, as you can see. So I'm fond of Coolidge for many reasons. One is that he loved cats. Another is that he loved Greek and Latin literature. His way of basically relaxing at the White House was to read Greek and Roman literature in the original Greek and Latin. He was trained as a classicist. Surely one of our most educated presidents. Coolidge here is shown with some of the top officials in his administration. He thought that government's role was to provide a framework within which people could seize opportunities and pursue their own vision of the good. We've talked about that some as an ideal that goes all the way back to Henry Clay's American system. This thought that government's basic job is to provide an infrastructure, to provide a framework within which people can pursue liberty, within which they can pursue opportunities, can pursue their own dreams, their own visions of the good. And he thought that that had important implications. Yes, government had to build that infrastructure. It had to create a network within which it was possible for people to pursue their own goals. However, it was important that it not go beyond. He was a big believer in what is known as the law of unintended consequences, which is to say that usually the unintended consequences of an action are actually more significant than the intended consequences. And when you move from personal life to governmental action, that is even more so. Usually the things that really are going to result from a certain bill's passage, for example, or a certain executive order or a war being fought or whatever, are not the things people have in mind at all. There are other kinds of effects that are unanticipated, unknown, unexpected. And so his point was that those unforeseen consequences were always a serious threat. Government action in particular, he thought of as something that was much more likely to cause problems than it was to solve them. And so, he said, there is far more danger of harm than there is hope of good in any radical changes. Coolidge was known for being very taciturn, for being a man of few words. In fact, at one point he said, what is the job of, he was asked, what is the job of president really like? And he said, well, basically, I sit there in my office. People come and ask me for things. They sit there, and I found that if I just listen and say nothing. Eventually they go away. And that was his philosophy of government. People will come in and demand things, just sit there, listen, say nothing, and eventually they go away, and you don't have to do anything. Because he thought usually what people are asking government to do is a mistake. It's something that is meant to benefit their interest, but is not actually for the common good. So the best thing you can do is to just say no. He was known for saying very little, as I mentioned. At one point, he was there at an official function, and a woman came and introduced herself to him and said, I made a bet with my husband that I could get you to say at least 3 words to me. Cooidge responded, you lose. Anyway, he thought there was something about human nature that was not only something likely to be messed up. I mean, in a way, the law of unintended consequences is a large-scale picture about the way social forces work, and the fact that most of the time we do not have a very complete understanding of it. But this point is different. He thinks that each one of us has an unconquerable desire to be the master of our own destiny. That is to say that liberty is something we value tremendously. Suppose, imagine 2 things, okay? You are thinking about having dinner tonight. You decide to eat a hot dog. You decide that. Why is somebody going, oh, hot dogs? Okay. It can be a vegan hot dog. I don't care, whatever you want. Fill in the blank with whatever you like to eat. And there's a big difference between you choosing to eat it and someone else forcing you to eat it, right? Suppose you would have just naturally chosen a hot dog or a taco or whatever it is. There's a difference between that and me somehow anticipating this and saying, you eat a hot dog. You're going to eat a taco. Even if it's what you would have chosen otherwise, it's not nearly as much fun if I'm forcing you to do it. And so, his point is, there is something in us that wants to be free, that wants to actually be masters of our own destiny, that wants to choose our own path. That same path will be something that has much more meaning for us, that we will enjoy much more, that we'll value much more, if it's something that is our own choice. Now, he thinks that recognition is built into America's founding documents, including, especially, the Declaration of Independence. So, he recounts some of the key points from the Declaration. He says, look, the Declaration of Independence stipulates that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with certain inalienable rights, that therefore the source of just powers of government must be derived from the consent of the government. Those he takes to be the fundamental principles of the American experiment, that all men are created equal. We're all endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that means government can be just only with the consent of the government. Now, his point is to turn that into a critique of Wilson in particular and of progressivism in general. He says, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It's often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. That, of course, is exactly what Wilson argued in The New Freedom, that the Declaration, the Constitution were designed for a horse and buggy era and were no longer applicable to the modern age. But he said that reasoning cannot be applied to this great term. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they're endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond those propositions. So he's really saying, well, either you think that everyone's created equal or not. Okay? You can't say, oh, well, I think they're even more equal than that. That's the end point. Similarly, if justice in government depends on the consent of the government, either you think it's important that there be that consent, or you don't. There's no way of sort of going beyond that. In fact, he says, really to deny that, to say no, some people are more equal than others, in Orwell's phrase. Or that actually there's no such thing as rights. The talk of rights is nonsense, as Wilson thought. Or that the consent of the governed is not required. He says that's not progress, that's actually going back. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction you can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward a time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction can't lay claim to progress. They're reactionary. Their ideas aren't more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary cause. So the point is that actually what Wilson's arguing for, this sort of rule by an elite, is a kind of aristocracy that was the kind of thing that was already under discussion in ancient Greece, that was part of the feudal worldview. That's not going forward, that's going back to something before the American Revolution, before the advent of democracy, to a condition where some people really are natural rulers and others are naturally the rule. So, well, Cooidge put this into action in a number of different ways. Here you see him getting an award from a civic organization. Here he is shaking hands with Walter Johnson at another of those opening day ceremonies. And Johnson, as you can see, seems much happier about it than Babe Ruth had been, shaking hands with his predecessor. Anyway, there was a very rapid recovery from World War I and the recession that followed. Hans Rosling is a Harvard professor who has some wonderful videos illustrating points statistically. And when he shows you death rates and growth rates and so on, if you click on the link, I won't do that now because of time, but it's a very, very neat video. I urge you to do it. And you will see in 1918, 1919, 1920, this sudden bounce downward. And he just exclaimed, "What's a catastrophe?" On the basis of the deaths of the First World War and then the Spanish flu epidemic. It is astounding. The world population just dies. However, it bounces back very quickly. There is a remarkably rapid recovery, not only in population, but in economic terms as well. Here is one of Coolidge's initiatives, the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. He's surrounded by people from various tribes for the signing ceremony. It was Coolidge who, for the first time, established citizenship for Native Americans. Okay, now, this is meant to show how dramatically taxes changed. In 1913, the income tax started. By the height of the war in 1918, tax rates had risen dramatically. As you see from that left-hand column, for various income amounts, and there were lots and lots of different tax brackets then, as you can see. People who made less than $4,000 didn't pay anything. But then the rate went from 1% of your income up to 7% of your income. That's a pretty low rate. However, by 1918, it went from 6% to 77%, a dramatic increase. Now, under Harding, it got cut back to, well, 4 and 58%. Then in 1924, under Coolidge, the top rate fell to 46%, then to 25%, then to 24% by 1929. So taxes went up dramatically under Wilson, but then dropped sort of in stages throughout the 1920s back to much lower rates. Today, what's the top tax rate? That is to say, it's the federal income tax rate, not including state and local taxes. It's like 45%. It's, 39.5%. So that would put it sort of somewhere in between the 1924 and 1925 things, but there was, in short, a dramatic change in tax policy, which is part of what generated the economic boom of the 1920s. And here you see some of that. The top is the unemployment rate. You see it reaching a high of about 9% in 1921, then falling dramatically and staying around 4 or 5% throughout most of the rest of the 1920s. Here, a chart showing economic growth, which reached a low in 1921, but then soared until 1929. And then, of course, the stock market crashed, but we'll talk about that later when we get to the 30s. This is what happened to the stock market during the 1920s. Now, what I really want to be concerned about are social changes and changes in ideas that went along with this. So first of all, some of those social changes. We've talked about the 1890s, around 1900, as the advent of the department store, of shopping districts in downtown areas and so on. By this time, in the 1920s, lots of people have lots more disposable income. And so you start seeing shopping spread throughout cities, not just in a few central cores, but it becomes a much more common thing. Stores end up being stocked, and education becomes much more important. By now, universal literacy has been established, not only in the United States, but basically all other advanced Western countries. And increasingly, people are starting to go to college. Here you see a group, the Hungry Nine, of college students. Notice that it's about half women. So there's a sort of story sometimes people have that women were held in a condition of oppression up until 1960-something when all of a sudden the world changed. Well, not really. There was a huge change in the role of women in society in the 1920s. Women began attending college in large numbers. Here you see a number of people working in a chemistry lab, including a woman. This was a time of changes, dramatic changes in fashion. This is an actress pictured in a 1920s costume. These were thought to be shockingly short dresses and skirts, right? Just horrifyingly short. And so, I mean, now, well, that's a classic flapper dress. Now people think of flapper dresses as, you know, kind of, well, like that, but shorter. Anyway. And in fact, already by the 1930s, this era was being remembered as one of shockingly short skirts and changes in fashion that were, you know, bizarrely sexy and so on. That's Betty Boop, a cartoon character from the 1930s, who was supposed to be one of these flapper girls from the 20s. And as you can see, the reality and the depiction are somewhat different. Here is another artistic rendering of the flapper in her dress. So, yeah, that's, well, anyway, that's what it was really like. Fashion extended to other sorts of things. These were dramatically new and daring bathing suits. You can see the three women up there, the babes for Herbert Hoover, with Hoover's face on their back. And there are sort of, that's a kind of fashion show of the bathing suits of the time. Here is maybe what more ordinary people wore. That's a photograph from the 1920s. Well, these social changes weren't just limited to fashion or to the involvement of women in education and this type of thing. It was really a fundamental set of social changes. Andre Siegfried wrote a book called America Comes of Age in 1927, and he described it this way. As a result of the revolutionary changes brought about by modern methods of production, the American people are now creating on a vast scale an entirely original social structure. Now, changes in manufacturing. What is he talking about? All of a sudden, consumer goods became available to a much wider range of people. And how did that happen?
Mass production.
Mass production, yes. Henry Ford, the Model T Ford. The possibility of having factories where you mass produce objects. And so every object becomes not some object of a particular craftsman's work, but instead something that emerges from a factory. It greatly reduced costs. And so here you see Calvin Coolidge, for example, standing beside a new car, a very fancy new car. Look at that horn on the side. There he is pointing to it. Anyway, air travel. The telephone. The telephone had been invented in the 1890s, but by now its use became widespread. So for the first time, people actually could talk on the telephone. Here you see cabinet members talking on the telephone. The radio. The very first radio station in the United States was KDKA Pittsburgh, 1921. And that radio station still exists, by the way. It and KQV, I think, are the only radio stations east of the Mississippi that still have things start with K, because they came into existence before the division between the K stations and the W stations. Anyway, radio became a huge factor in the 1920s. Here you see a young man excitedly listening to the radio on his headphones. And here you see two people listening. Now, radios quickly got to be fancy like that. My grandparents had a radio like that. Here she is looking, or listening to, I assume something semi-scandalous. Here is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, pictured listening to the radio. And here are children listening to the radio. Children in hospitals, it became a big thing. Just as you might have a television in your hospital room now, it was a new thing to have a radio in your room. There were typewriters. Typewriters enabling people to actually type things as opposed to handwrite them for the first time in their homes. The advent of large shopping districts and mass transportation. Notice the streetcars. Theaters. Movies. Yes, here, these posters. Stolen Love. Saturday Night. The Face in the Fog. Okay, and it was the era of the movie star. Here, I love this photograph. Those two people in the movie are being taught how to kiss so that it will look like a kiss on film. Okay, so yeah, no, that's not bad. Make it look romantic on film, you gotta do it this way. It's controlling your head positions. All right. Well, then we've got the Marx Brothers, for example. We've got Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy. We've got Charlie Chaplin, and a variety of other stars at the time whose names you wouldn't now know, but were very famous in their era. There was also a new classlessness in dress, in speech, in behavior, in attitudes, partly because of radio. Radio brought standard English and a kind of common culture to everybody across the country. It also, well, happened in movies. People went to movies, they heard a certain speech. If you listen to movies, a lot of the ones produced in the 20s still were silent. Some actually were talkies. By the 1930s, though, people were talking. And listen to some of those movies. It is striking what was the standard American accent in the 1920s and 1930s. It's not exactly what it is today. In fact, standard American speech today is basically what you hear the lower class characters speaking in these movies. The upper class accent of these movies from the 20s and 30s was non-rhotic. That is to say, people did not pronounce final R's. Bring me the car. Okay? Now it sounds very stilted to say, bring me the car. Or, I mean, it sounds like you're from Boston or something. But then that was standard American speech. So it has shifted over time, and it's interesting to observe those shifts. However, the classlessness was something that really is dramatic. And it's been dramatic even over my lifetime. My parents, well, let me start with me. Do I have an accent? Some of you are saying yes, some people are saying no. Okay, so yeah, you're not sure whether I have an accent. If you were to hear my father talk, I think it would be very clear to you that he has an accent. If you were to hear my grandparents talk, you would have been astounded, okay? Some of their speech would have been unintelligible to you. And it wasn't because they had thick German accents or thick Slavic accents or something like that. It was because of the regional style of speech. Now, if you travel all around the country, people talk a little bit differently, but more or less the same. On the other hand, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. Even when I was a student, I went to high school for a while in Virginia. Somebody from Alabama moved to our school. None of us could understand it. Her Alabama speech was completely unintelligible. In fact, when I first started teaching at UT, I could tell right away whether a student was from East Texas, or West Texas, or Dallas, or Houston, and so on. It was very easy to mark out people's accents. And now it's not so much. You all sound more or less the same. And all Americans sound more or less the same. There are still some regional differences, but they're much less severe. And part of the reason I mentioned my grandparents' speech is that, well, they would have learned to speak as young people before these social changes. But anyway, the whole idea is that people in one part of the country could not understand people from the other part. If you were from Philadelphia or you heard somebody from Pittsburgh, you could barely understand what they were saying. If you were from Virginia and had a kind of cultured Southern accent, somebody would come in from around the top, you'd have no idea. Anyway, you really couldn't tell what they were saying. I can't even imitate it. I don't know what she was doing because I couldn't understand the words she said. But anyway, all of that has changed and changed dramatically just in the last few decades. As a result of radio, movies, and then later television. There was a cultural liberation. Women began working outside the home in large numbers. A spread of education. The literacy rate in the United States was 96%. The number of people attending college rose dramatically. And there was a cultural flowering in literature, the arts, and music. Now, this is part of the 20s that I think is often neglected. But it really was, in some sense, the high point of American culture. It has been more or less all downhill since then. Look at the figures who were active at the time in literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, John Dos Passos, Theodore Dreiser, William Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe, Eugene O'Neill, Thornton Wilder. Okay, most of the high school curriculum in English classes is really from the 1920s, and authors who were active during the 1920s. This was also the era of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Connie Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, James Weldon Johnson, Elaine Moff, Claude McKay. All of those African-American writers were at the height of their powers. Well, some were a little older. Locke and McKay were a bit older and served as kind of gurus for the rest of the group. But But still, these were people who were all at the height of their literary activity. There was a tremendous amount of cultural, literary production, artistic endeavors, and so on. There's County Cullen, Zora Hurston. In painting, you had people like Edward Hopper, Maxfield Parrish, George Bellows, John French Sloan. In photography, people like Man Ray, Alfred Stieglitz, Ansel Adams. In sculpture, Alexander Cullman, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who started the Whitney Museum in New York City, Daniel Chester French. And I'll show you things by all of these people in a moment if the names aren't familiar to you. This was the era of the first U.S. show of the works of Pablo Picasso, the opening of the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. It was the time of the founding of the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA, in New York City. It was also the advent of the first Mickey Mouse cartoon, of Popeye. Anyway, there was just this huge advance in American culture. Here you see Edward Hopper, Night House. This is his most famous painting. He didn't do this until 1942.
Oh, I know that.
But, oh yeah, this is... Yes. There are versions. I've got versions with a cat in the background or with Homer Simpson there, and a donut, etc. But this is what he was doing during the 1920s. Here, Girl in a Sewing Machine, 1921. That's not the... that's called Automat. I forgot to update this, so I copied it. This is what happens when you copy and paste and forget to make the changes you need to make. Okay, but that's called Automat. She's presumably waiting for her laundry to be done. And here, that house is really creepy, isn't it? House by the railroad tracks, actually, that one's called. And that's not from 1921, that's from 1925. But now, anybody recognize that house?
Yeah, it's the house that Psycho.
Yes, exactly. That's what inspired Hitchcock to have the house from Psycho look the way it does. He was inspired by this painting. Now, this is Maxfield Parrish, Daybreak, from 1922. Parrish is often now considered kind of a joke. But actually, that painting sold more copies in reproduction than any other painting in the 20th century. I'm not sure why. It's been used as album covers and book covers and all sorts of things. Here you find, well, actually, I've got this on our course webpage. Dempsey and Furco, 1925, by George Bellows. This dramatic, realistic style of painting. Here, a painting by John French Sloan, The City from Greenwich Village, 1922. Sloan was a socialist who painted a lot of scenes from New York City, his hometown. Here, McSorley's Cats, 1928 and 29. Notice the cats over on the right. Now, Man Ray was one of the only American artists who actually left the United States and spent most of his career in Paris, partly because American art was still relatively traditional at this time. We're going to talk a lot more about European art and what was going on there. It was a move toward abstract expressionism, toward Dada, surrealism, and a variety of other things. Here is Man Ray's Object to be Destroyed in 1923. It was simply a metronome, a sort of ready-made object. He also had The Gift, 1921, an iron with a bunch of tacks glued to the bottom. He was inspired to do that the day of the exhibition. It's like, what am I going to put in the exhibition? I got this iron. I was going to iron my shirt. Ha! There's my artwork. Anyways, Dada actually shot the original Object to be Destroyed in 1957. They acquired the work, put it out there, and took out a gun and actually physically shot it. Much to the concern of the local police force in any event. At that point, Man Ray actually reproduced the object, and the one you see here is actually what he's now called Indestructible Object, produced in 1964. So, but it was a replica of Object to be Destroyed. Alfred Stieglitz, his most famous photograph is actually the series from 1907. And he was active in the 1890s and early 1900s, but he was still active as a leader in the movement of photosecession throughout the 1920s, and began camera work, a journal, but also a school educating other photographers. Here is his photograph of his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, in 1922. Ansel Adams did Monolith, the Face of Half Dome, one of his most famous photographs of California realism in 1927. And he did a whole series of those types of photographs. You can find those all over the place. They're still very popular subjects for calendars and other things. Here is a display on a museum exhibit now of the works of Alexander Calder. You can see that Calder is already doing highly abstract work in the 1920s and kept that at that throughout his career. This is a sculpture by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Buffalo Bill, 1921. And Daniel Chester French is most famous for Abraham Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Now, in music, there was a similar story to be told. A lot of the great American songbook was produced during the 1920s. Great composers like Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, George and Ira Gershwin, Aaron Copland. And this was also the height of the jazz age. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, Hoagie Carmichael, Bessie Smith, Fats Waller, Jelly Roll Morton, Ella Fitzgerald, and so on. So here you see, actually that's Irving Berlin, and there, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. There you see Hoagie Carmichael in the movie playing the piano, and on and on and on throughout this era. Now, all of that was a huge, you might say, cultural advance. Up to this point, America had really viewed itself as in something like the shadow of Europe. But we could say in the 1920s, for the first time, American art, American music, American literature really achieved a world-class status. It was no longer true that really, you might say, if you wanted a serious education in all sorts of fields, you had to go to Europe. If you wanted to experience the best of the art world or the music world or the best of literature, the best of philosophy and so on, you had to go abroad. All of a sudden, American literature was fully as exciting, as wonderful, and as rich as the literature from anywhere else in the world. However, there was something else that happened in the 1920s, because there was an elite group that increasingly began to identify itself, not with these new developments in American literature, art, music, etc., but instead with those European counterparts to which people naturally had to look before that. So the Education of Henry Adams is a good example, published in 1918. It's a book filled with educated disillusion. In a way, feeling as if this American culture is changing in ways that this intellectual elite, educated before the war, before all of this flowering, found strange and off-putting, and in some ways, distasteful. So this group really began to be ambivalent about America. Before, they saw Europe as a kind of ideal they wanted to imitate, and thought of the United States as striving to imitate Europe. But think about people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, or Ernest Hemingway, or Theodore Dreiser, or Thornton Wilder, or a variety of the artists and musicians I mentioned. They were not imitating European counterparts. F. Scott Fitzgerald was not trying to write like an English novelist. Neither was Thornton Wilder. And think about Duke Ellington, let's say, or Louis Armstrong. They were not trying to be the American Mahler, or the American Brahms, or Bruckner, or something like that. They were doing something dramatically new. And so a split emerged in American intellectual culture between those who basically looked at all of these American developments and said, that's not what we had in mind at all, and began to be disillusioned with that and with the United States in general, and clung to that European ideal of what excellence is. And then another group that said, no, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Theodore Dreiser and Duke Ellington and Aaron Copland and so on, those are defining what culture is for the United States. And so a split occurred, really, in the American intellectual group. Van Wyck Brooks put it this way in 1917, expressing the attitude of the elite that was hostile to a lot of these developments. Never forget that it is we New Yorkers and New Englanders who have the monopoly on whatever oxygen there is in the American continent. Okay? There's starting to be a divide between these New England, New York intellectuals and then the rest, in a way that, well, led to a sort of attitude of cosmopolitanism and almost looking down on these American achievements. An aggressive dictatorship arose, Paul Johnson writes, of a self-appointed scholastic elite who were claiming a monopoly of authentic knowledge. And so there was an East Coast cosmopolitanism, reflected especially in Boston and New York, but in other places too, that found itself at odds with the pulse of America during the 1920s, found itself clinging to a different vision of excellence, a different social order, a different concept of art, of literature, of philosophy, of music, and so on. And I think a great way to look at this is the view from New York. This was the cover of the New Yorker in 1976, expressing the idea that I'm talking about. There you see 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, the Hudson River, Jersey, Kansas City, Nebraska, the Pacific, China. That sort of division of the people like Brooks, who were talking about New York and New England as being the heart of America, as really having all of its oxygen. Basically, there's as much of the world and as much importance between 9th Avenue and the Hudson River